In a cramped attic on a hot summer evening, 5 people are working tirelessly to create history. A 24-year-old girl is cutting out cardboard figures in different shapes and sizes. A man is busy designing exquisite scenery on tissue paper, while the man next to him is busy doing God knows what with soap and sand. Well, they're making a film that upon its release, every theater would deny to show it for the simple reason that it hasn't been done before. A film whose novel techniques would be copied a decade later by Disney, propelling the studio to new heights. Nearly 300,000 shots would be taken to make this film, each of them a result of painstaking labor and immense patience. This is the story of the world's oldest animated film and the forgotten genius behind its making, Lotte Reiniger. The Adventures of Prince Achmed was released in 1926, 11 years before Disney's first feature Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out, making it the first animated feature film in history. Even though this status is often challenged by an Argentinian film El Apóstol that claims its release in 1917, the claim remains just a claim. No surviving copy of the film has been found, and the claim relies entirely on the memory of Quirino Cristiani, its creator. But why does this film look the way it does? Because it isn't the sort of animation we're used to. It's a silhouette film, and we don't see the characters and backgrounds the way we normally do in reality. There are just black shapes and outlines. That might come off as a serious limitation, but that's precisely what lends the charm and beauty to the style. To compensate for the lack of a full view, the outlines are made as detailed as possible. Take this image of Cinderella for example. She's got graceful feet, curly hair, ragged clothes, and a bent head. These details are more than enough to signify grace, beauty, poverty, and modesty, traits that Cinderella is known for. John Caspar Lavater, a Swiss writer, wrote he could deduce a man's entire character from the outline of his profile, arguing the silhouette of a person's face or body reveals insights into his moral and psychological traits. Well, try guessing his moral character from the outline. Of course he was capping, but the fact remains you can tell a whole lot, with just the outlines. Our film here, The Adventures of Prince Achmed, begins with deception. It's the Caliph's birthday and there's a festive celebration going on in Baghdad. We see jugglers and acrobats performing acts and the Caliph rewarding them with gold. But this would not go on for long. An African sorcerer, obsessed with power and evil in nature, arrives at the scene and presents a flying horse to the Caliph, refusing any amount of gold in return for it. The Caliph then tells him to name anything he desires and promises to give that as a prize for the horse. The answer shocks him though, for it's the Caliph's own daughter the sorcerer wants, the beautiful princess Dinarzadeh. He starts dragging her with him until Dinarzadeh's brother Prince Achmed intervenes and stops him. The sorcerer then persuades him to try out the horse himself, but that leads to his own capture by the Caliph's soldiers after Prince Achmed mounts the horse, flies high up in the sky but doesn't come back since he doesn't know how to bring the horse down. He is carried off to distant mystical lands far, far away from Baghdad. What follows next is an adventurous journey through exotic lands, unexpected friendships, and relentless trials, where Achmed must conquer every obstacle that comes his way. This story, as you might have deduced by now, is an amalgamation of tales and characters from the Arabian Nights. Lotte Reiniger, the film's creator, chose the fantasy genre to suit the capabilities of animation, to be able to do stuff that live-action films couldn't do at that time. But the story of the medium that made this film possible traces its roots way before the Arabian Nights and is just as intriguing. It's ancient China. The emperor has just lost his beloved. He's depressed and is neglecting all his duties as a ruler. But an artist's got an idea to deal with this. He cuts out a figure of the emperor's beloved, puts it behind a silk screen, lights the screen from behind creating a shadow, and begins to move the figure, adding his own voice in her imitation. Now, nothing else could delight the emperor more than seeing his own beloved come to life. He regains himself and at once resumes his duties. This, according to legend, is the birth of shadow puppetry that laid the foundation for our silhouette film to be made centuries later. Another legend says it originated when live theater plays were organized to be viewed by ladies behind a lit screen. Whatever the origin may have been, it soon became the opera of the emperors and the theater of the masses. People loved it. The shadow puppets were cut from leather and beautifully adorned. A silk screen was rigged on a table and a light source was placed behind it. 3 rods were used for playing the figures, 1 to hold the figures and 2 for animating the arms and making other delicate movements. Countless stories could be told through this art form. It just required the right skill and imagination. But China was not the only place where this was being done. Roots of shadow puppetry in India can be traced as far back as 200 BC. It was hugely popular in the south of India and some other parts in the north. Large leather puppets were perforated and dyed with vegetable dyes, bringing a touch of color to the performances. The plays were based on Hindu scriptures like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Therefore, they were considered holy and people watched those plays with great reverence. It was similarly very popular in Indonesia. The shadow plays here were known as Wayang Purwa. Puppets were made with leather, perforated, ornamented, and painted with vibrant colors. The plays were performed on nights out in the open and a musical orchestra accompanied them. A stick on top held the figures and beautifully carved sticks were used to animate the figures from below. Bamboo frames were used to hold the screens and then they were lit from behind. These plays were also considered holy by the people since just like the Indian shadow plays, these too were based on the ancient Hindu scriptures. Outside Indonesia, there are accounts from the Crusaders of the existence of shadow puppetry in Egypt as well. But we don't see shadow puppetry in Egypt today, unlike China, India and Indonesia where such plays are still performed. But now let's take a leap centuries later when shadow puppetry finds its way to Europe. We'll come back to the film, but this is important. It's the 18th century Europe and people are talking of plays that have come all the way from China. The essence remains the same, but the ways have changed. Great care is taken not to let the viewers see the strings and wires attached to the puppets, and the puppets are now controlled from below. And the plays are no longer historical, artsy or religious. The Judy and Punch puppet shows, for example, that popularized shadow puppetry again after a period of decline, are played at night and are primarily comic, irreverent and even crude at times, featuring slapstick humor and exaggerated scenarios. They mock societal norms and portray the daily struggles of life in humorous ways. Shadow plays even begin to be performed in homes for entertainment. Soon a permanent shadow theatre opens in the city of Versailles, France in 1770. The founder is François Séraphin and he achieves great fame with his shadow plays, and his play The Pont Cassé goes on to influence greatly the shadow plays that come after. Many other theatres for shadow play open, and with advancing technology, demands from shadow plays get greater as well. The lighting, movement, stories all become more intricate and artistic. With such rich history and evolution does shadow puppetry find its way into Lotte Reiniger's life, who of course was fascinated with shadow puppetry from a very young age. She'd spend her days making paper cutouts and animating them with delicate precision. She'd even put on theatre shows for her family like Snow White and plays by Shakespeare. Ancient Egyptian artworks and Greek fast paintings inspired her paper cutouts, where characters used to be in profile and we could see both the shoulders, hands and legs of the figures. In her book Shadow Puppets, Shadow Theatres, she takes us to her childhood and tells with great passion how she used to animate those figures. Her puppets were not cut in whole. They had a few separate movable parts attached later with strings like a movable leg, a movable arm and a forearm. She'd carefully decide where to punch holes in the figures and would attach cinemoid strips or rods to handle those figures and control their movement. If the figure needs to stand erect, a strip is attached to the head and fixed to a box beneath the figure. If the figure needs to kneel, one rod is attached to the shoulder and the other is attached near the hand. When the shoulder is pushed down and the hand is pushed up, the figure acquires a kneeling position. If the figure needs to walk, a rod is attached to the hip and fixed along one leg, while another rod is also attached to the hip but fixed along another leg. The figure then starts walking when the strips are moved correctly. If the fish needs to swim, a rod is attached to the side of the fish and the fish swims with the movement of the strip. The rods had to be held at an angle of 45 degrees so they weren't visible to her viewers. Speed was also something to be kept in mind at all times to control the pacing of the plays. Action scenes required greater speed, peaceful scenes required less. The extra characters in the frame were made static by resting their rods on a table, while the moving characters kept both the hands of the animator occupied. One might also wonder at this point, why should any of this have been interesting back then, to the viewers or to the animator? The figures can only move an arm and a leg, most of the characters in the frame are static, the facial expressions of the figures remain the same, and it's a lot of work for the animator. Was it even fun? In the introduction to The Defendant, one of G.K. Chesterton's remarkable essays, he writes, "The coarsest and bluntest knife which ever broke a pencil into pieces instead of sharpening it is a good thing, insofar as it is a knife. It would have appeared a miracle in the Stone Age. What we call a bad knife is a good knife, not good enough for us. We choose to call the great mass of the history of mankind bad, not because it is bad, but because we are better." And he was right. We scoff at the idea of a wooden wheel, not circular enough, coarse and with rough edges. But to the humans who lived ages ago, it was indeed a miracle, a monumental achievement that would forever change the course of their history. So it would be unfair to see Lotte's shadow puppetry in retrospect. To her and her viewers, it was fun. But of course, limitations it did have that would soon be broken. At the time she was busy animating her puppets in her home, something else was brewing around in Europe, a revolution that would change storytelling forever. Lotte watched her first film at the age of 9 or 10, a film called Sleeping Beauty that left her greatly enchanted, and it was here that her love for cinema was born. She was also captivated by the early fantasy films of George Méliès like A Trip to the Moon and The Kingdom of the Fairies. So a few years later, she enrolls at a theatre school in hopes of becoming an actress. But even there, she doesn't lose touch with her childhood hobby. She starts cutting out silhouettes of other actors in the theatre and receives much praise for it. As a child, she could paint, read, and recite poetry as well, but people took note of only her cutouts, since she was mighty good at this. So even in the theatre, it continues to be a passion for her. She has no idea where it would lead her though, and such are often the beginnings of great things.
いろんなものをいっぱい持たなきゃいけなくなったから大きくなっちゃっただけどジブリなんて困ってさ飛行機の名前で思いついてジブリとか言ったんだから
Soon enough, Lotte gets to attend a lecture by a famous actor and filmmaker of the time, Paul Wegener, on the possibilities of animation. She even manages to get some small jobs in his films, like cutting out silhouettes for film titles. But her first real experience with film animation comes during the production of the film The Pied Piper of Hamelin. She is part of a crew that has to release rats on the set when instructed. The main character of the film, the Piper, is to play a tune and all the rats are to follow him. For this, real rats are tried first in great numbers. They are simultaneously released in hopes that they would follow him, but as you'd expect, they flurry off haphazardly in different directions and the shot is a mess. When that fails, guinea pigs are tried. They are painted grey and given tails, but instead of following the Piper, they just remain there idly and the shot is a mess again. Then it strikes them that they should try wooden rats, and with great labor and a lot of time, the wooden rats are filmed in stop motion, with slight changes in positions of all the rats, followed by photographic shots of the camera. The shots are then played in rapid succession and the rats follow the Piper out of the town. With such experiences under her belt, Lotte was now ready to make things of her own. So in 1918, she joined an experimental studio and there she made her first silhouette film, The Ornament of the Enamored Heart. It was just 5 minutes long and showed two people dancing together. The film was also shown in the theaters. She then went on to make more short films and commercials, thereby establishing herself in the film community of Berlin as an avant-garde animator. A few years later in the 1920s, Weimar Germany was facing a turbulent economy, yet it boasted of a vibrant film industry that was churning out legendary films like Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. One day, Lotte was approached by a banker named Louis Hagen. Now, he was someone who had bought a lot of film material in hopes of profiting from it. But now, his stash of film was depreciating in value day by day because of the economy. So he wanted to put it to good use, and what better use of it than to create a feature-length film out of it. But not just any feature-length film. It would be an animated feature. This was unheard of at that time, but Lotte agreed. And so began the production of this beauty of a movie, The Adventures of Prince Achmed. Louis Hagen agreed to finance the project, and in 1923, Lotte Reiniger, with 6 other collaborators, set out to create the first animated feature film in history that took 3 whole years to be completed. Silhouette animation was simple, yet difficult with its own challenges. A glass plate covered with transparent paper was fixed into an opening in a table. Above the table lay a fixed immovable camera and a light source was placed beneath the table. The room had to be made dark enough and the cutout figures had to be placed on the glass plate, which created dark silhouettes when the light source below was turned on. Slight changes in the position of the figures were made and each position was shot by the camera above. When all the consecutive shots were lined sequentially and played in rapid succession, the figures moved, danced, jumped, and flew. The structure that was used to film The Adventures of Prince Achmed was very elaborate and primarily consisted of wooden beams and steel support for the camera. And the room where this film was made was a small attic in the vegetable garden of the same Berlin banker, Louis Hagen. Figures were cut out with a combination of lead and cardboard. cardboard for flexibility when changing positions, and lead for giving a certain weight to the figures and helping with stability and precision. Now the limitations that held shadow puppetry were no longer there. The figures could now have any amount of movable parts. What used to be this could now be this. The figures could move however the animator wanted them to move. But this new possibility brought with it its own problem. How exactly to move the figures with all the new parts they now had? How should the upper body move when the figure walks? How should the hip move when a figure jumps? How do the wings move exactly when a bat flies? These questions challenged Lotte, but she knew where to find the answers. In her book, she takes us to the time when she started studying her own movements in front of the mirror to figure out how humans actually moved. She would very carefully observe the movements of every animal she could find outside. She would even visit zoos to study animal movements and try to imitate each movement herself. She would study skeletons of animals in museums and often walked on all four legs at home, putting to life whatever she had studied and observed. Such detailed study of human and animal motion would allow Lotte to bring unprecedented realism and fluidity to her animation. Now she could even turn a ballerina with grace and precision, and she describes how. A leg is moved slightly, the profile head is replaced with a frontal head, some more movements of the legs and head, and then the head is changed again to a profile head, but on the right. Look how the arms move in the process and how the hands change too. The whole film brims with such complicated and realistic movements of the characters. Before the production of the film began, a storyboard had to be created first. It contained valuable information to work with, like illustrations of shots, the number of shots required in particular scenes, the nature of the shots, whether they were close-ups or wide angle, and many other such details. The music was also pre-recorded before the production began, so the movement followed the sound and not the other way around. Great care was taken to harmonize the movement of the figures in the film with the rhythm of the music. Silhouettes of all shapes, forms and sizes were cut out, and even larger and smaller cutouts of the same figures were made for the same scenes. Doing this would help in transitioning from wide shots to close-up shots. But why not just use the camera for that? For a few reasons. First, this helped in making the edges of the silhouettes clear and not blurred, which zooming in and out with the camera might have caused. Second, there could be logistical problems of moving the camera from above. And third, because there was another limitation of shadow puppetry that could now be broken. The expressions of the same character in the same scene could now be changed with a transition from a wide shot to a close-up. Details like eyebrows or eyelashes or lip position could be added or changed between shots for creating variety in the character's expressions. The finger parts could be used to add movements like curling and grasping. Since the camera used to capture the scenes couldn't move, the backgrounds themselves had to be panned horizontally or vertically. The making of such backgrounds, however, required a lot of labor. Lotte didn't want the stuff in her backgrounds to be completely dark without any depth. So to create that depth in background, many transparent papers were laid on top of one another and a sketch was drawn on the topmost layer. The paper then had to be cut accordingly. The darker layers of the background, like the windows, had more layers beneath them to create more opacity, and the lighter areas, like the walls, had fewer layers to create less opacity. The darkest areas were cut with cardboard instead of transparent paper and were placed on top of another layer above the background to avoid messing with those layers. If some scenes required less dark background, like daylight scenes, some layers were then withdrawn to create more transparency, and the backgrounds were a bit lighter as a result. Of course, Lotte Reiniger wasn't doing all this alone. Among her 5 collaborators working in the attic, one was her husband Carl Koch himself, who helped with the production and technical aspects of the film. Bertolt Bartosz and Walter Ruttmann gave the film its special effects. Alexander Carden and Walter Turk worked as assistants and helped Lotte in cutting and animating figures and backgrounds. Wolfgang Zeller gave the film its enchanting musical score, to which the animation was set. These were no ordinary men though. Carl Koch, Lotte's husband, was a writer and filmmaker who worked with filmmakers like Renoir to make movies like La Marseillaise and The Grand Illusion. Years after giving the special effects to the film, Bertolt Bartosz would go on to make the film The Idea, the first animated film to ask big philosophical questions, a film that proved animation could be poetic. These magnificent sea waves in The Adventures of Prince Achmed were animated by Bertolt himself, using an incredible technique that would take the field of animation to much greater heights. Walter Ruttmann, who also worked with him on the film, was a brilliant abstractionist who would go on to create his own renowned films later, the Light Play Opus series. He created some of the most wonderful moments in the film, like magic events, erupting volcanoes, and such awesome spectacles. But it's Zeller's fantastic music that takes this film to a whole another level. The real magic in the film happens when Lotte's animation coincides harmoniously with Zeller's music. Not all effects in the film, however, were created by Bartosz and Ruttman. Many of them were created by Lotte herself, who didn't just know how to animate figures, but also how to vanish a character from the screen and to bring to life characters on screen out of nowhere. Take a look at this vanishing bat, for example. For such an effect, an exact replica of a figure is put on top of that figure on the glass plate, and then the original figure under it is taken away. The replica is then cut away shot by shot, and it keeps getting smaller with each shot, until there is no more left of it. When the shots are played in rapid succession, the figure looks like it has vanished from the screen. Around the time this film was being made, depiction of the Oriental world was not new in German films. A cultural fascination with the Eastern world existed there, which led to many filmmakers of Germany produce films set in the East, like Ernst Lubitsch's Cimarron of 1920, Joe Mays' Das Indische Grabmal of 1921, or Fritz Lang's Der müde Tod, released the same year. That trend might have been a reason Lotte chose to make her film based on the Arabian Nights. The time was also when German expressionist movement in cinema that gave us films like Metropolis was at its peak, so a lot of the features of those expressionist films seep over into the Adventures of Prince Achmed, as can be seen in the exaggerated movements and expressions of these characters. Also, silhouette in film was something that had already been adopted by some directors like Arthur Robison. He had hired a silhouettist named Engert to create a shadow play as part of his film Schatten. But never before had a film been made completely from silhouettes, and Lotte and her crew were determined to make one. But how does Disney come into the picture? What was it that Disney took from this film that set it apart from its rivals? It was
the multiplane camera.
What used to be this, with the help of the multiplane camera, could now be this. Disney's multiplane camera, that was inspired from the one used in The Adventures of Prince Achmed, was made of many horizontal glass plates, often containing oil paintings of backgrounds on them. These planes could be moved in all four directions and could even be brought up or down. With each successive frame of the movie, the planes changed position slightly, the lower planes undergoing less change in position, the upper planes undergoing more. The result was a mesmerizing display of background depth. In Lotte's film, the multiplane camera was used for the scene where the horse takes our hero Achmed up through the stars. Numerous stars were put on transparent paper on the first plane, fewer on the second below, and even fewer on the third. The third plane was moved slightly every 4 frames of the movie. The second moved faster and changed position every 2 frames, and the first moved the fastest, changing position at every frame. The result was this depth in the background you see, where the sky in the background comes to life. There was, however, another way Bartosz would create an effect on stars. He would pinprick a cardboard and move it slowly before the camera with a strong light behind the cardboard. This would be a videographic shot though, not photographic. He would then turn the cardboard upside down and take another videographic shot by moving it in another direction but at a different speed. He would then superimpose the second shot on top of the first, and the result would look something like this. The multiplane camera was also used to animate these clouds to create that effect of depth, and it was the same camera that made possible this iconic scene from the movie to be created. Remember, this was 1924. Most of the effects were a result of complete trial and error by the crew of this film, because they had no precedent. Relentless experimentation was done to find out novel ways to film certain scenes. For this scene, different waves were cut out for each frame of the scene from transparent tissue paper. Each wave was then placed on different planes of the multiplane camera. The ship was placed on the second plane under another wave that was on the top plane. All the waves were then replaced with another set of waves after each successive shot. Changes in each set of waves were made the same way as in the stars and clouds, with waves behind undergoing less change in motion than waves in the front. It was a very tedious process, but the end result was this dazzling display of sea waves in motion with great depth in the background. For the moonlit waters of the kingdom of Wak Wak, Bartosz would use silver paper to create the perfect look. Soap, it is quite extraordinary. With soap, one can do everything, he once remarked. He used soap for the layers of clouds. For volcanic lava, Walter Ruttman used sand, and in some scenes like this, actual paint was used. With such tedious and innovative labor that went on for 3 years, The Adventures of Prince Achmed was at last ready for its premiere in 1926. Each of the crew invited as many viewers as they could, including personal contacts as well as strangers from the street. No theatre, however, would agree to play this film since all this was so new to the theatre owners and they just weren't willing to take that risk. So the crew members decided to present the film themselves. The concert hall of Volksbühne was chosen to show the film, where the film's score composer Wolfgang Zeller was himself in charge of the orchestra. At this premiere, which was taking place in a darkened hall, the makers didn't think the people would come, but the hall was soon overcrowded with people flocking in great numbers to see the film. Legendary filmmaker Fritz Lang was one of those people who were there for the premiere. I had never seen anything like it. They clapped at every effect after every scene, he would recall later. Everyone who saw the film sang praises for it. It did get distributed all around the world after its premiere, but the process was slow and its spread was mainly from word of mouth. When the film premiered in Paris, even Renoir, the great French director, saw the film and truly loved it. Lotte and Renoir would go on to collaborate in films later. But in the glitz of all these awe-inspiring action scenes and special effects that adorn the film, it's easy to overlook the subtleties in the film and Lotte's mastery in being able to portray just any kind of motion or emotion possible. Peri Banu's gracious walk in the lake, for example, is so delicately animated that the whole scene feels so uncannily real. The way she moves, light and effortless, captures so fully her elegance and her ethereal nature that Achmed falls for. And this subtle moment of awe as he gasps upon seeing her is so telling of her mastery in pacing and characterization. And so is this when Dinarzadeh lovingly touches Achmed's cheeks as an affectionate display of sisterly love. Look also at how the sorcerer's eye movements alone in this scene manage to capture his personality and his emotion after being surrounded by the Caliph's soldiers. An example of brilliant pacing in the movie is this scene, where the sorcerer secretly approaches Prince Achmed to capture him and pounces upon him at once. When it comes to intensity, Lotte is just as capable of portraying such emotions, be it Achmed desperately pleading the sorceress for help or Aladdin expressing gratitude for slaying a monster. This is another brilliantly animated scene, the evil sorcerer persuading Aladdin to go down the well for bringing him the magic lamp and Aladdin's reluctance to do so. Aladdin's movements in pain after falling down into the cave and his further hesitance before touching the lamp also show how successful Lotte can be in conveying emotions. Sometimes intensity and banality need to be shown in the same scene, and Lotte aces this just as well, as in the scene where the Caliph hears the news of Achmed's arrival. The sheer contrast in his motions, mood and behavior is so stunningly portrayed. The characters in this film, however, as you've noticed, appear to be stereotypical, like the Chinese emperor, and sometimes even offensive, like the African sorcerer. Should we deduce then that Lotte Reiniger just knew how to cut silhouettes and knew little of the outside world? That she had little sensibility of issues like race and nationality? Perhaps yes, because her later works do show a marked reduction in stereotypes. That may have been due to her increased understanding of different cultures obtained through frequent visits to different countries. There was also a trend in Germany at the time to portray the Eastern world in a caricatured way, and it's possible Lotte just picked that up. Perhaps it was the limitation of the silhouette medium itself that she had to resort to stereotypes to portray a fuller picture of her characters. Or this was all deliberate and the Eastern world serves as a heterotopia for Lotte Reiniger to enable her to say things which she could not say normally. We'll see what a heterotopia is, but for now we'll have to abandon the surface level of the film and go deeper. And when we do that, a whole different world of embedded themes and messages appears to us that paints a very different image of Lotte from that of an ignorant artist just obsessed with her art. Now, before we proceed, it would be better if we familiarize ourselves with the rest of the plot. But worry not, since this movie, like all the great books and movies on the earth, is spoiler-proof in nature. The movie is much more than its plot, so let's get that out of the way to be able to admire the beauty that exists beyond the whats and whens of the film. Stranded on the magical islands of Wak Wak, Prince Achmed, after a brief lusty encounter with the maidens of Wak Wak, hides and secretly watches Peri Banu, the beautiful ruler of those islands, as she begins to take a bath in a lake. He steals her feather dress, without which she cannot fly, and takes her to a different location. Then, after confessing his love for her, he tells her to come with him to his home. She refuses, but when he returns her dress in despair, she agrees. They're both in love now. This, however, proves to be very short-lived as the African sorcerer tracks them down and kidnaps Peri Banu. The sorcerer flees to China with her and sells her to the emperor. Meanwhile, Achmed, left stranded on a volcano by the sorcerer, faces certain death until he is rescued by a powerful sorceress who lives in that volcano. Moved by Ahmed's love and determination, the sorceress agrees to help him. The sorceress and Ahmed travel to China, where they interrupt the forced wedding ceremony that's taking place between Peri Banu and the emperor's hunchback dwarf Ping Pong. Just as they're reunited, demons loyal to Wok Wok appear and they take her back to the islands. Ahmed follows, but the gates of Wok Wok are closed. He learns that only the magical lamp can open the gates. He then slays a monster who is about to devour Aladdin, who reveals how he came in possession of the magical lamp in a cave, his marriage with Dinarzadeh, and how he lost the lamp to the evil sorcerer. The sorceress again comes to their aid and uses her powers to summon the sorcerer, engaging him in a fierce magical duel. She ultimately defeats him and retrieves the lamp. Armed with its power, Ahmed now confronts the demons and heroically rescues Peri Banu. And with the lamp restored, Aladdin also reunites with Dinarzadeh. At the end, they all return safely to Baghdad with the help of the magical lamp, where the Caliph grants his blessing to their unions and a joyous celebration ensues. With the plot out of the way now, let's come back to those embedded themes and messages in the film. A Foucauldian heterotopia, for it was the French philosopher Michel Foucault who coined the term, is any place that exists in reality but is different and stands separate from the ordinary world. Examples could be a church, a library, or a cemetery. You get the idea. It evokes a sense of otherness from the ordinary reality. The Eastern world then, in the form of a heterotopia, allows Lotte to critique the Western society where she and her intended viewers lived. But this happens at the expense of stereotypes. For the Eastern world has to look exotic and has to appear different from the ordinary Western world to bring that feeling of otherness. Such a Foucauldian heterotopia is different enough for the viewers to imagine new possibilities, yet familiar enough to suggest that such possibilities could also apply to their own world just as well. The architecture and the whole scene in the beginning of the film seems otherworldly to the Western viewer. Yet when Dinarzadeh is being kidnapped, it all seems familiar, something that might have happened to them, and they feel shocked. It also evokes something else that is familiar to the Western viewer, a Brothers Grimm story about a man and his daughter being trapped and outsmarted by a magical being. In this case, the Caliph and Dinarzadeh being trapped by the sorcerer. The whole point of the use of a heterotopia is this. We don't critique when we see ourselves, yet when we have critiqued, we start seeing ourselves. Using this heterotopic setting then, Lotte sets out to embed themes of equally rebellious nature as the film itself. The theme of female eroticism in the movie, for example, is evident in many scenes. This scene in the kingdom of Wok Wok is one such scene full of sensuous elements. The way the maidens kiss Prince Achmed, the dance, the way they fight for him are all part of this theme. The lake scene that follows afterwards is just as erotic. The theme is reflected in Peri Banu's posture, figure, and movement. The constant attempts of Peri Banu to kiss Prince Achmed throughout the film reflect the same theme of female eroticism. Another theme Lotte manages to convey through this film is the idea of feminism. This she shows here when Achmed returns her feather dress to Peri Banu that he had stolen. Peri Banu then chooses Achmed instead of giving in to his forceful desire to be his love. Her constant initiation of kisses throughout the film instead of that by Achmed is also a reflection of this feminist theme, and the presence of a powerful yet benign female figure, the sorceress who helps Achmed and Aladdin, further emphasizes this theme of feminism in the film. And no, Lotte doesn't just stop there. Taking it a step further, she even manages to embed themes of homosexuality in the film. 1926, and the film contains such progressive ideas. The depiction of homosexuality in the German films of that era was something she didn't like. Homosexuals were usually portrayed as a tortured and humiliated class of society. But Lotte wanted to portray homosexuality in a normal, romantic, and dignified way. There was a scene in the movie, an explicit scene where the Chinese emperor kisses his lover named Ping Pong. But as you guessed, this scene was censored and couldn't make it. But Lotte's brilliance shines here as well, with a crafty use of ambiguity and subtlety. The emperor's lover is mentioned as a Liebling in the film. Now Liebling, a German word, can either mean darling or favorite, and it's this play of words that Lotte uses to convey the theme without fear of censorship. We know Lotte meant darling and not favorite because of this film that came after. Der Scheintoter Chinese puts the Chinese emperor and his Liebling Ping Pong at the center of the story. At the end of this short film, we see this. There is another subtle depiction in the Adventures of Prince Achmed that conveys this theme. The rescue of Peri Banu by the sorceress can be interpreted as the witch being her knight in shining armor. and similar is the heroic save of Aladdin by Prince Achmed. Politically speaking, Lotte Reiniger, just like her husband Karl Koch, had communist sympathies, and that shows in her works. This was the reason she even had to leave Germany after the Nazis came to power. Lotte's choice of her life in silhouettes may have been a feminist or a communist choice, picking a sort of low art belonging to the women or the unsophisticated art of the plebeians and taking it to new artistic heights. But we can only guess. She never said so explicitly. Wherever we hear her, she just speaks of silhouettes in a passionate, childlike fashion.
Horse into the sky, we had 3 layers of stars laid out, and the one moved slower than the other. At home, I met Romeo and Juliet and all that.
She wasn't explicitly political, nor was politics the driving force behind her films. Yet we can't help but notice these subtle political messages. Be it the intersocial and interclass romance in this scene, where a prince kisses maidens that seem to be of many different races, or the romance of Aladdin, a tailor, and Dinarzadeh, a princess, there are such messages. But of course, this all depends on how much emphasis we put on her intent, because in later films, we do not see much of such messaging. However, it's safe to say that if she could go as far as homosexuality, she could explore communism. Greed, we find, is another such communist messaging in the film. The caliph, greedy for the magical horse, promises anything in return to the sorcerer, and that costs him a kidnapping attempt of his daughter and a dent in his image. The sorcerer, greedy for Dinarzadeh, himself pays for it later. Even Achmed, greedy for the horse and Peri Banu, is faced with his own troubles in the film. These messagings, however, would stand in stark contrast to the ideology that was about to sweep over Germany a few years after the film's premiere. She made a few films later staying in Germany, but realized she wasn't very safe in her own country anymore. Perhaps this was a reason we don't see much of the political themes in her later works. She and her husband moved out and spent several years moving from country to country as long as their visas permitted, until they finally settled in the UK. There she went on to make more silhouette films for the BBC. Despite enjoying popularity and praise after its premiere, The Adventures of Prince Achmed would soon fade into obscurity though. This happened because Lotte had to leave all her past works in Germany, and the original copy of the film got destroyed in the Battle of Berlin in 1945. Fortunately, a colored nitrate-positive copy of the film survived, but it would be decades before the restoration of the film would be carried out. The footage that you see is a result of the same restoration effort from that nitrate-positive. And yes, the film was colored from the beginning. Lotte didn't make a completely black and white film. She colored tinted her film stock to create multicolored backgrounds, and that makes the film the first colored animated film as well. These colored backgrounds signify different moods and temperatures in the scenes. And luckily, Zeller's music was also not lost. It was retrieved from the Library of Congress in Washington that had the nitrate print of the score. After her husband's death, Lotte traveled around the world, giving lectures and conducting workshops on silhouette animation for young filmmakers until her death in 1981. She once said this in an interview:
I am not very good at making people laugh. I make them smile.
And how can one not smile when they see something like this?